Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire was released in 2005 and this time was directed by Mike Newell, written by Steve Kloves, and is based on the fourth Harry Potter book by J.K. Rowling. It stars Daniel Radcliffe, Rupert Grint, and Emma Watson once again, and this time follows Harry Potter as he finds himself competing in a hazardous tournament between rival schools of magic, but he is distracted by reoccurring nightmares. I've been excited to finally get to this one out of all the other films because this seems to be an interesting one for some people. Goblet of Fire is a beloved Harry Potter film, but it's also one that fans of the movies either place near the bottom or near the very top of their rankings. I, for the longest time, was one of the former. I never really loved this movie nearly as much as a lot of its fans do, and even after this viewing, I still don't love it amazingly. One of my best friends professes that this is his favorite Harry Potter film, but I just can't say the same. However, that said, after this most recent rewatch though, this is on the lower end of my Harry Potter movie ranking. I still think this is a great movie nonetheless that has some slip-ups here and there that just bother me and dampen a bit of my enjoyment. Now, sometimes it is hard to separate an adaptation from its source material. Trust me, when we get to it, I have a ton of problems with Half-Blood Prince. But as for Goblet of Fire, the fourth Harry Potter book, I would say is my second favorite in the entire book series. But its adaptation, I can't say the same for it. And it has nothing to do with any changes they made from the book, but rather the choices they made as a film that ultimately bother me. That said, I will state once again, I still think this is a great film. But when we get to my issues, perhaps you'll understand a bit more why it's not one of my favorites. However, with that out of the way, let's get into talking about this one by going behind the scenes to see just how this film was made. Something very interesting right from the start with this film is that Chris Columbus, the director of the first two films, considered returning to the director's chair for the fourth film, but he ultimately declined due to his children wanting to spend more time with him. M. Night Shyamalan was approached once again to direct the fourth film, but declined due to having more interest in making an adaptation of Life of Pi, which would eventually go on to be made by Ang Lee. It was finally decided that British director Mike Newell would take on directing duty. Interestingly enough, if you recall my previous review on Sorcerer's Stone, you would know that Mike Newell was even considered to be the director of the first film. Work on the script began in April of 2003, and during the pre-production phase, just due to the size of the book they were adapting, it was thought that the film would end up being too lengthy for a single film, and considered shooting it as one, but if they had to, they would split it into two. They had always considered it as two films, but could never determine how to eventually split it up. But Warner had no interest in the idea at the time, an idea that would eventually lead to the birth of the final book being released as two separate films. It was Mike Newell who believed they could accomplish making the film into a single entity rather than two, and still remaining true to the book. Janie Timmy returned once again as the costume designer for Goblet of Fire. She would make things such as the Beauxbatons uniforms using French blue silk so that they stood out from the muted colors from the other schools. Durmstrang would use thick wool for their costumes with crimson robes and fur hats and capes, having been inspired by Russian folklore. For the Yule Ball alone, 300 costumes were created. Just like in the previous films, Stuart Craig returned as the film's production designer. Locations that had been used before in previous movies were reused and redecorated, such as the Great Hall for the Yule Ball, looking more like an ice palace. Each task for the Triwizard Tournament required massive sets to be built, such as the rock quarry for the first task. The second task required both a blue screen and a massive 20-foot deep tank for the actors to swim around in. And finally, the massive hedge maze, which was constructed both practically and with CGI enhancements to increase its scale. Principal photography began on May 4th of 2004, but shooting with the main cast wouldn't start until June 25th of that year in Leavesden Studios in England, with the film eventually wrapping in March of 2005. Local areas around Leavesden Studios were used for the Quidditch World Cup, as well as several other locations around England. Parts of Hogwarts were filmed at Oxford College, much like what had been done on previous films. Goblet of Fire was a much larger production than any of the previous films and required far more sets and locations than had ever been used before on these films. As for the music, John Williams could not return to score the fourth film due to a busy schedule, and he would never end up composing any more for the Harry Potter franchise onward. Instead, Patrick Doyle served as his replacement. Originally, Doyle was supposed to work with Williams's material, but by the end of the production, only Hedwig's theme remained of the original score. There were also many changes made from the book to get this film to a watchable length for audiences, and so many fan-favorite moments or side plots had to be cut, as Newell wanted only the scenes that were about Harry and his journey through the film, something that would be repeated in the next film, Order of the Phoenix. The film was released on November 18th, 2005, and made a total of $896.8 million on a $150 million budget. As for critical reception, the film received universal acclaim, scoring an A on CinemaScore from audiences. The maturity of the characters was what impressed critics the most, as these young characters began transitioning into adults. However, the film did receive criticism for its clunkiness and being disjointed, and supporting characters not getting enough screen time. And finally, with that all out of the way, let's finally get into my thoughts on this film. As I said before, Goblet of Fire is not one of my favorite Harry Potter films. It has things about it that bother me, but nonetheless, it is still a film I walk out of enjoying and even loving, as is the case with the majority of the Wizarding World movies. However, I think there's a difference between criticizing a film for what it doesn't have from the books and criticizing what's actually in the film itself. Goblet of Fire was truly a huge deal for the Harry Potter franchise, as it's the true moment where the Harry Potter films grew up. You could say that's the case for Prisoner of Azkaban, which deals with more mature themes, but Goblet of Fire adds a lot of complexity to the series that will continue on through the last film. So I would say this is the starting point of that, and as for how it accomplishes that, I think it does a phenomenal job of rising to the occasion and giving us a more mature Harry Potter film that might not have as much character as was present in the previous film, but makes up for it with tension and spectacle. So let's go into what I love about this film. Much like with the third film, I think the young cast continues to show improvement in every film. By this point, they know their characters inside and out, and are their characters, and provide a strong screen presence, and can even go toe-to-toe with some of the older members of the cast. Daniel Radcliffe is great. I don't think he's as good as he was in Prisoner of Azkaban, which asked a lot for the actor emotionally, but he's still great. I also love the new cast as well, even if some have smaller screen times than others. I particularly love Brendan Gleeson as Alistair Moody, or should I say the fake Moody in this film. He's funny, intimidating, and kind of frightening as well. There's so many weird moments where the camera just sticks on him, making him super unsettling. I also have to mention Roger Lloyd-Pack as Barty Crouch Sr., Robert Pattinson as Cedric Diggory, as well as Jeff Rawle as Amos Diggory. However, the one that surprised me from the first time I saw this film was Ralph Fiennes as Voldemort. I think this is the best the character has ever been in any of the films. He is chilling, commanding, and just incredible in the one major scene he is in near the end of the film. I love everything about his look and design as well, and I feel like he just doesn't look the same in the films that follow. But on top of the new cast, we have returning players that are always fun to watch. Whether it's someone playing a student or a professor, they all do a solid job. And yes, even Michael Gambon as Dumbledore does a great job, even if the internet has memed the part where he yells at Harry to death. His performance at the end of this movie is what sold me on his Dumbledore for the rest of the franchise. Next, I want to talk about the look and feel and tone of this film. I spent a lot of time in my Prisoner of Azkaban review talking about the change in tone and the look of the films with Prisoner of Azkaban and all the films after. And I won't go into any more detail, but I will say I think this film strikes the perfect balance for what I think the Harry Potter movies should have strived for in terms of look after the first two films. Goblet of Fire blends the warmth of the first two films with the darkness of the third film to make one of the best looking Harry Potter films. This movie also knows how to set a mood right from the beginning of the film with the scene taking place in the Riddle House, as we watch a secret meeting taking place. Blended with the music and the gothic look, it makes for quite the impression. The third act is also filled with this kind of dread that I've never felt in any of the other Harry Potter movies, especially when we get to the maze and the graveyard scene. These moments are so well realized and make for a very memorable film. There's so many other little things to talk about in this film, such as the wonderful fun Yule Ball sequence, where we even see characters like Neville shine. The hilarious scene of Mad-Eye Moody turning Malfoy into a ferret, and especially the three tasks themselves. These sequences are as grand as they were in the books. Harry Potter finally is put on a massive scale in this film, and we get a fantastically tense dragon chase, as well as an underwater rescue, and finally the maze itself as the hedges try to consume the champions and test their will. I love the little moment where Dumbledore tries to give the champions a pep talk before they enter the maze, and how they might even lose themselves along the way. Combined with this and the graveyard scene and all that comes after, I think Goblet of Fire single-handedly has the best third act of any of the films. The resurrection of Voldemort, the death of Cedric, the fight between Voldemort and Harry, the reveal of Mad-Eye Moody to be Barty Crouch Jr., and Cedric's memorial are held with such importance. The scene where Harry returns with Cedric's body and the moment his father goes to his son's body and cries is truly a heartbreaking moment and probably the saddest or second saddest moment in this entire franchise. And thus we end a film with a somewhat bittersweet finale as the Harry Potter franchise finally grows up. I could go on for even longer about the things I like about the film, but it's that time where I talk about the moments that kind of just bother me in this film. For one, I'm a screenwriter. Obviously, I have no authority in what I'm saying, but in my time writing, I've paid a lot of attention to structure and pacing, and the first act of this film has always rubbed me the wrong way from a structural standpoint. As soon as we join Harry on his trip to the Quidditch World Cup, things just feel wrong, and we have a lot of information quickly thrown at us with no time to breathe as they set up this Quidditch World Cup. Then we finally get there, and there's this awkward cut to the aftermath. I understand why this was done. The Quidditch World Cup is an important part for the story. Our characters need to be there, even if what happens in the actual match isn't important. But the least I would have done would be to set up Victor Crumb's character more, to show how good he actually is, and just so they don't waste all that setup for nothing. I also get really annoyed by the characters and the humor in the film. Yes, they act like teenagers, and this is something that is in the book, but when put on screen, some characters just start coming off as angsty and even unlikable. Prisoner of Azkaban had its angsty teens as well, but I felt like it was handled better in that film. As for the humor, there's a lot of hits and misses for me, especially when it comes to the very odd humor that comes off as sexual, such as Harry being in a broom closet with Rita Skeeter, and she mentions how cozy it is while she almost seductively moves her body. For one, that's gross, he's 14, and then there's the weird scene of Moaning Myrtle really liking that she can see Harry naked in a bathtub. It's just odd. Or the moment where Professor Flitwick is crowd surfing at the Yule Ball. It just doesn't work for me. This film also suffers from something I mentioned in my Chamber of Secrets review, that being its attempts to make literally everything so much more intense and drawn out. Such as the dragon chase, which I still find fun, but as an example, Harry doesn't just have to fly to get the egg. He has to be chased by a dragon on the loose, nearly fall down off of the Hogwarts towers, and it's moments like that which are great for spectacle, but a bit much as well. Although I will say all that stuff isn't bad, it's just something I observed while watching. I have to admit, too, that I am not a big fan of David Tennant in his Barty Crouch Jr. role. There's promise there, but by the end, he's just super over the top in a way that doesn't feel fitting with the world of this film. It just ends up making him kind of lame and unthreatening. And lastly, I'm not a big fan of Patrick Doyle's score for this film. There are some tracks that are nice to hear as you're watching the film, but it's very repetitive and far from the melodic pieces brought to us by John Williams. It's a good score for the film, but not a very memorable or singable one. However, at the end of the day, these problems still make for a great film that does have moments that annoy me and bother me, but it also has some of the franchise's best moments in it, especially the very end of the film with the third act. The performances are mostly all solid, and it paved the way for a much more mature franchise moving forward. I like its complexities, action, and magic, but those small problems I do have with the film bring it down a notch for me, but I still think this is a great film nonetheless. So, with all that said, I'm going to give Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire an 8 out of 10. Well guys, I hope you enjoyed this review. What do you think of Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire? As for me, I can see why some would put this as their favorite, although the problems I have with it are hard to ignore for me, but I definitely can't understand some of the hate the film gets from some fans who I think take some of my criticisms I have with the film even more to heart. But anyway, that's all I've got for you. So, as always, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel, and stay positive.